Well, hello and welcome back. I am here with my friend and relationship coach, Kellyn Legath. Welcome, Kellyn. I'm so happy that you're back on the show.
Hi, thanks. I'm so excited to be back.
So, me and Kellyn, we went to life coach school together and we were in the same class and we have remained connected ever since. And I absolutely love it. I know something that many of my listeners struggle with is finding people that are on the same journey as them. And I just love having people in my life that also just really enjoy that self awareness and that personal development. So, I highly recommend that everybody become friends with a life coach because it is like the best thing ever. So I'm so excited that you were here.
I sign off on that 100%. Specifically, this journey is so unique. And, I have friends that are entrepreneurs and things like that, but it's very different to have a friend that's on the specific journey that you're on, whether it's like moving to a new place for the first time or being a mom or whatever. So I'm so thankful for you and being on this crazy journey together.
Oh, me too. And I love it that you know how sometimes you just want to go and vent to a friend. And I love that whenever Kellyn is that friend, then she'll ask me, she's like, okay, did you want me to coach you on this or just listen? And even that we can just be that honest and bold with each other that, okay, what is the need right now? Because I can totally rant and rave with you, or I can coach you on it. And so it's really nice to have somebody there that's just willing to fill a need for whatever it is that is needed.
Oh my
So,
gosh. You know what? It's such an important thing. I wonder if you've experienced this in your life. I kind of had to change how I was in all relationships after coaching. Like, I was like,
yeah.
wait, hold on. How am I showing up here? So it's so easy with you because we're both on in that headspace all the time. But sometimes my other relationships, it took me a minute to adjust and to be like, okay, hold on. How do they want me to show up here?
Yeah. And that is such a good introduction to what we're going to be talking about today. Because today we're going to be talking about what does it look like when there's imbalance in a relationship, and then eventually getting to that place where you can acknowledge that I am just responsible for my piece and what is my piece to own in this imbalance. So, yeah, so let's just jump right in, shall we?
Let's do it. Let's do
So,
it.
Kellyn, what are some of the signs that somebody might notice when their relationship is out of balance? What might that look like?
Yeah, there's a few things. It's so funny that you're asking me this. I just put a worksheet together because I think this is something that I wish I would have had in my life as I was navigating friendships to
Mm,
be able to kind of have like a North Star for like, is this a healthy relationship?
mhm,
It's a bit of a checklist. So there's many different factors. Communication, trust, respect, support, those are the main four. But there's so many, right? There's growth, which we were just talking about, right?
mhm,
Growth in relationships. Are we supporting each other's growth or does it feel like we're dragging each other down,
mhm.
right? Or is there conflict within that? Gratitude and equality are really important pillars within knowing whether your relationship is imbalanced. Equality in the way that, like, are we both contributing to the relationship? And to your question, that's a huge one, right? Is one person giving more than the other? Or is one
Mhm.
person taking more than the other? Is one person always reaching out? I'm sure you hear that with your clients often. I think I get that a lot. Is one person always reaching out and then they don't hear from the other person or they feel like they don't make an effort? So that's a big one. And like I said, I think I said support right off the top, but support's a really important one because it's not just supporting when you're going through a hard time, which I think a lot of people think of when they think of support, especially highly sensitive people. Like, hey, I
Mhm.
need support. I'm going through an emotional experience in my life. Support is also like celebration. Like, I'm supporting what you're going through, what you've accomplished, and all those things. So it's really these pillars that you can kind of look at and ask yourself these questions. Like, are we communicating in this relationship? And usually as you go through, you'll see, okay, one of these or many of these feels off. And that's sort of the indication.
Yeah. I like how you pointed out, am I actually asking for support around the good times and the hard times? And what does that look like? Because as you mentioned, I do work with the highly sensitive people. And oftentimes in this population, they do feel like they are the ones doing most of the work. They're doing most of the emotional processing. They're doing most of the holding space. They're doing most of the investing into the
Yeah.
relationship. And so it's really interesting. I'm glad that you brought that up, the communication piece, because sometimes it really is that simple. It's just asking. But when we're so sensitive to other people's needs, it's like we're turning down the volume on our own needs. So
Mhm.
it can feel so overwhelming. Should just be like, "Hey, so remember how I was really nervous about how that interview is gonna go? And, like, guess what? I actually got that promotion or I got the job. Would you be willing to celebrate with me?" Instead of just assuming that the other person will know what it is that you want or how you want to celebrate and what it's going to look like. And I love that you brought up even in the good times because sometimes we have an easier time acknowledging what it is that we need in the moment when we're having a hard time. We can say,
For
"Hey, I just need a friend," or "I need somebody to show up for me." But to take that time to also think about relationship is also being there for each other in the good times. And what does that level of support look like? So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Totally. And I think, I'm a highly sensitive person and I didn't realize it until so much later in my
Mm,
life. And I think when I look back, so much of how I was showing up in the world was like putting other people first.
mm,
To that point, when it was time for me to celebrate myself, you're stuck in between a rock and a hard place,
yeah.
right? Because the attention feels really uncomfortable. But you're also like, "Great, and if you don't give me attention, and if you don't celebrate me, I feel left behind. I feel forgotten. I feel not celebrated. The relationship feels imbalanced, and there's a lot of disappointment to process,
Mhm.
and that's a really tough place to be in. So, it is certainly a balance, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that oftentimes in this population too, they are almost like hyper independent. And so
Yes.
so it's like, I don't wanna burden anybody. I am highly sensitive to how it is that they would experience things. And so since I don't wanna be a burden, I'll just go and quietly do this by myself. But then we find out later after the fact that, "Oh, okay, I'm actually feeling a little bit hurt and resentful that they didn't show up for me." And it's harder to acknowledge that, "Oh, but this is something I created for myself because I didn't ask, I didn't tell, I didn't share." So do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on how to overcome that?
Oh my gosh, I think that feeling of being a burden is so real, especially for people with anxiety and depression. I definitely know people with depression. They get into this space of feeling like I'm going through a really hard time. I'm asking for a lot. And then I feel like a burden. I feel like I need more. And that feels hard to do. But then they end up not communicating. That's where communication shuts down, right?
Yeah.
Instead of even saying, "Hey, I'm feeling really guilty about how much I need right now," or
Yeah.
whatever the case may be, they sort of just shut down, and then I think a lot of times what I see people that feel like they're a burden, they try to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They try to act like everything's fine. And it's really, really hard to navigate a relationship in that way. Because as a friend, as an outsider, you're like, "Oh, well, they just asked if we wanted to go to the farmer's market. They must be okay, you know? They must be okay." And then what's happening with that person, the reality is like there's a lot of emotional turmoil and there's a lot of suffering. And I think to avoid being a burden, like you're saying, they put on a mask or they put on a show and it's self-serving. There's no judgment in doing that. It makes sense, right? I think that's something that you always say that sticks with me. It's such a beautiful way to express that, to validate your experience,
Yeah.
to say it makes sense that you're doing that, that you're afraid that if you ask for more, someone's going to say you're too much.
Mhm.
Or if you ask for more, they're going to say, "Hey, you're not showing up for me." And then you have to explain, "I can't show up for you right now." And that feels really bad because you want to be in a different place. And then there's
Yeah.
shame and judgment on that. And it becomes compounding. So that feeling of being a burden, I think so many people can relate to.
Yeah, and it is compounded. Like you said, if you're a highly sensitive person and you're also struggling with depression and anxiety, then number one, you're not going to be sharing how you feel because you don't want to be a burden to other people. And then you might find that then, even if they are reaching out to you, maybe you're not as responsive because depression has you in that more self isolating state. And then you're experiencing guilt and shame on top of it because you're not reciprocating when usually you're the one carrying the load. Right, so it kind of compounds everything and just raising that self-awareness, and as you were talking, I was thinking a huge piece of this is inviting in radical honesty and radical vulnerability. To be
It a
honest with
hundred
yeah,
percent.
like, I want to go with you to the farmer's market, and I know that on the outside it looks like I'm fine, and I'm really having a hard time. I
Right, right.
remember, several years ago, I had purchased some little herbal supplements that were a mood support, And I had told a friend of mine, hey, yeah, I'm really having a hard time. And so I purchased, I think that they were maybe even literally called happy pills. And I was like, yeah, so I got these little happy pills to see if it helps. And that was me being vulnerable and sharing. And the response I got in return was she kind of laughed. And she's like, well, that's just so funny. Like picturing you depressed is so funny. That's just so out of character for you. But I recognized I had been doing the masking. I hadn't actually been sharing. So of course she would think, okay, well, that's kind of funny. She's like jumped into these herbal pills and trying to figure things out for herself. And I never even knew she was having a problem. Like that's almost laughable because yeah, because she was calling me to go to the farmer's market, right? Like exactly what you
Right.
said. Like, okay, well, what's my piece is maybe I wasn't actually being honest and maybe I wasn't actually being vulnerable. And maybe that's my piece to own in this imbalance.
Yeah. I think what you're touching on, oh man, you're touching on so many things. But, I think what's happening is when we talk about vulnerability, it doesn't mean having to dig deep and expose your soul to another person. It
Yeah.
can just be, I am feeling pretty depressed, naming your emotion,
Yeah.
which is a skill that most people don't have, but naming the emotion and saying,
Yeah.
hey, I am feeling really depressed right now. I want to feel like a human and I would love to just go to the farmer's market with you. Even though I am struggling, I don't want to talk about it. And then we're
Mhm.
bringing in boundaries, which again is another skill that most people aren't taught. And, it's something that everyone can learn and should
Mhm.
invest in learning, right? But then saying, I don't want to talk about it. I really just want to have a day where I can get out of my head a little bit. I think
Yeah.
that's what a lot of people are experiencing and probably is that what you were feeling in your moment of trying to show up and trying to be
Yeah.
happy and trying to get back to yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds so simple how you just said it. Like, as you just said it, I was like, "Oh, that's so beautiful." To be like, "Hey, I am feeling depressed, and this is what I would like to do, and I just wanna feel normal." And it sounds so simple, and I totally get that it can be really hard to get to that place because it does require a significant amount of self-awareness and a significant amount of bravery to just acknowledge that, "Hey, this is me." And maybe you're gonna consider this to be a burden, but this is where I'm at. Like, it is what it is. And that helps you, as you said earlier, said asking the question, is this a healthy relationship? Sometimes we have to test the waters to discover if it's a safe relationship or not, if it's a healthy relationship or not. It requires testing it to see, okay, I'm going to share that I'm struggling, but I don't want to talk about it. And I'm going to see what happens next. And we have to wade through those waters in order to get to that place where we can actually determine, are they a person that can show up for me in the way that it is that I need right now?
Right. Oh my gosh. And I think there's something to be said about the strength that it takes to kind of communicate and set that boundary, right? Because I'm playing this farmer's market experience out in my head as we're talking through this, but I'm like, sometimes you get to the farmer's market, you go and you get your strawberries and you start to feel a little bit uplifted.
Mhm,
And then the person that's there to support might
mhm.
be like, I kind of see an opening. Do you want to talk about this? The experience
Yeah.
might come up of like, hey, I know you said you don't want to talk, but I want to check in.
Mm,
And that takes a ton of self awareness to be like, am I just sharing with them because I feel like I should? And I feel like they want to know and doing it for them versus doing it when you're like, "Oh, I checked in with myself and I do feel safe enough," which, it's quite a test, but it's the truth. It's like, "Wait, I
mhm.
do feel safe enough to just be like, hey, I've been struggling with this," and talk about a small part of it or whatever. So we're also talking about this, like you said, and sure, I can break it down in 2 simple steps.
Yeah.
Communicate what you want and set your boundaries and
Yeah.
but and I feel this way about a lot of information on the internet. There's a lot of course, bold statements and all fighting up against an algorithm. So we're all trying to like hook people. But that sort of like if they wanted to, they would, or let them theory. It's like, sure, it's a great theory, but putting into practice is an entirely different thing. And
Yeah.
to commit to learning these skills, you really have to learn to be uncomfortable. And to be honest, most of these people are really uncomfortable with the emotion,
Mhm.
carrying the heavy emotion that they're in already.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does require emotional intelligence for both sides, right? Because if it has been the case where you're the one doing all of the emotional processing, it can take some practice to allow the other person to practice stepping into that role of nurturing you and helping you to emotionally process and to know that, okay, it might be a tiny bit messy. And I want this relationship to be sustainable for me. So we're going to test the waters. I'm going to let them develop those tools, knowing that I've been taking on the heavy lifting, but now it's their turn. But then also that if you are on the receiving end of that, letting go of the idea that, no, but my friends should be happy all the time, or they should be showing up in these ways, and knowing that, well, maybe I'm feeling uncomfortable because something is coming up for me, but that doesn't mean that they've done anything wrong, but kind of differentiating self, where it's okay for two people to have two separate emotional experiences at the same time.
This is such an important conversation because now we're focusing on this person that's having a hard time, but to your point, the emotional awareness from the other person, right? Imagine being in those shoes and someone who you deeply care about or are friends with for a long time kind of put the wall up and say, I don't want to talk about it. Because I've been in that position also, and I can
Mhm.
tell you that I felt very boxed out and a lot of, well, how do you not feel safe with me? And sort of like, well, I thought we were really good friends. Why do you not want to talk about this? So there's like a
Yeah.
little bit of push and there's like disappointment and kind of hurt, right? Like it's sort of like, oh my gosh, I feel really close to you and now you don't want to tell me. So did something happen? And then the brain can start a million stories, right? And it goes back to the question that you asked me in the beginning about pillars of how do you know if you're in a healthy relationship or if a relationship is balanced? And we can talk about respect.
Mhm.
Respect that when someone says, "Hey, I don't want to talk about this," that we say, "Okay, I respect that. I respect that you're not in the place and that you know yourself enough to know that talking about this right now will be more difficult for you
Mhm.
or harder for you." And I think for the person in that sort of, I guess we'll call it like an opposing position
Mhm.
to be like, you know what, I respect this.
Yeah.
Um, just say, I'm going to own my emotions on the other end of it. And
Right.
yeah, I am disappointed, and that's mine
Yeah.
to manage, not this other
Yeah.
person.
Yeah, I love that, that we do tend to take it really personally. I mean, I don't love that we take it personally, but I love pointing this out because
I love that we're taking this person.
yeah, because highly sensitive people, they have their superpower and they have their kryptonite, right? So the superpower is I am very highly attuned to everybody else's emotions, but then the kryptonite is we take it so personally. It makes it really hard for a highly sensitive person to take it at face value when somebody says, I'd rather not talk about it right now. Then we do exactly what you said. We write the story in our head that, well, they must not feel safe with me. And it's a judgment on me and my character, when really they just might not be emotionally ready yet to talk about it. They want to choose their words. Maybe they're an internal processor. And so they're trying to find their words so they can communicate it verbally. There could be so many things happening for them. But we tend to take it personally, and then we're essentially boxing ourselves out, right? Where we just decide,
100%.
"Fine, I'm out then," rather than actually just taking it at face value that, "Okay, let me know when you're ready." It can be that
Right.
easy to just
Well,
say,
think
"Let me know
about
when you're ready."
yeah, yes. Think about what that causes, right? When you start to feel boxed out and then you're like, "Oh, well, they didn't wanna share with me, and now I'm mad at them."
You're
And
right.
it's like and it's like, "Oh my gosh, now we're stuck in this tangled web," and I think this happens all the time in relationships. I mean, we're talking through the lens of friendship, but, you know, parents and kids and
Mhm.
in romantic relationships, if you're
Yep.
like, "Oh my gosh, my partner's not sharing with me," it's like, "Oh my god, they're not sharing with me. Are they lying? Are they lying in other places in the relationship? What's going on?" The brain we are all creative. To say that some people are creative and other people aren't, we are all storytellers in the way that our brain just runs free sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, so it can create more turmoil within the relationship.
Yeah, and it shows such significant emotional maturity to be able to differentiate self, right? Because like you said, when we then have our big emotional reaction to someone just telling us, "Hey, I don't wanna talk about it right now," we're hijacking the situation, right? We're making it about ourselves, which isn't very kind, right? But we take things so personally, it's easy to
Mhm.
do that. And so acknowledging like, "Okay, I hear you. I can just receive that without making it about me," is such a huge sign of emotional intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the biggest breakthroughs I had with my own personal growth and mental health journey was just that. It was the acknowledgement of just I was making everything my responsibility. I was making everything about me. They're not calling, so it's about me. They don't want to tell me why they're depressed, it's about me. They're mad, it's about me. And sort of taking that, releasing that burden was such a huge breakthrough in my growth experience. I look at it through the lens of inner child, but it was like, oh my gosh, if this person's mad at me, it must be my fault. It's very kind of black and white thinking, but again, a really protective way to just keep you safe, to be like, I'm trying to find a reason for this. And if the reason is me and I know that ahead of time, then no one can kind of sideswipe me and call me out on anything and hurt me, or it's protected. Just
So true. It's protective and it gives us a false sense of control.
yes.
I think a lot of us tend to overown because if it's my fault, then it means I can fix it. And I can fix it in my way and in my timeline, and I don't have to worry about them. Because it really does feel a little bit, disconcerting when we have to wait for the other person's timeline and wait for them to be ready. Then we're stuck in this place of anxiety, right? And
Yes.
so then we tend to, like you said, we're over owning the situation. And I love that you brought up that we tend to over own because that's so true for this population. And what we're talking about here in this episode is what does it look like to own your peace? So, what are your thoughts on owning your peace without over owning and taking on their peace?
Yeah. It's a really important distinction to make,
Yeah.
right? And there's two pieces of it, right? And like you said, most of the population is sort of uh, hyper independent.
Mhm.
We're internalizing so much. You can own we talk about this all the time in coaching. I know
Mhm.
you've talked about it on your socials. I've talked about it before. That there's only so much we can control. And I think control is such a huge part of this, right? I love that you kind of segued into that because if you asked me even 2 years ago if I'm controlling, I'd be like, no. Oh my God, no. And then I was like, oh, wait, I'm trying to control so much. I'm trying to control how people are showing up. I'm trying to control their reactions. And I'm like, I'm not a controlling person, right? So there was a break in who I was at my core and how I was showing up. So we can only control our own thoughts, our own feelings, and our own actions. We
Mhm.
can't control the actions of other people. So I think bringing it back, and again, we're kind of oversimplifying it for people, but I think bringing it back to those things where people go wrong in owning their side of the street is that they own that they made somebody else feel bad, or they own that somebody did something hurtful. And it's just like, you just don't have that much control over people. Wouldn't it be lovely if we did? Wouldn't it be great if we could just make people do what we want them to do all the time? I've tried. I've tried. It doesn't work. If it has worked for you, let me know.
Yeah.
But it's something that we talk about all the time. So, it's that distinction between owning something you said or something you did,
Mhm.
but not taking on the other person's experience. And I
Yeah.
think that's where the line is.
Yes. Yeah, that's something that I talk about quite a bit in my coaching practice is somebody will really think through. In fact, just yesterday I was coaching somebody on this, but they're really thinking through, okay, how do I want to engage with this person? I want to work things out with them. I want to problem solve with them. How can I make a repair with them and how can I show up well? So then they have the perfect words and they show up really well. And then the other person doesn't receive it how they thought that they should.
Mhm.
And so then they think, "Oh, no, I must have done it wrong because if I did it right, then they would have shown up differently."
Sure.
How do you navigate that when because that's another example
Yeah.
of over-owning, right? But really
Right.
differentiating, "No, but I felt good about my words. Their reaction
Yeah.
is about them." But again, it's so much easier said than done. Do you have any pointers around identifying
Yeah.
that?
Honestly, I think this is what we're talking about is really an emotionally difficult thing to go
Mhm,
through. We're talking about it in such a light and informative way, but I think the reality of these situations is so deeply painful or
mhm.
can be really painful for people and so disruptive. I'm always talking about the brain in my practice and I'm like, "Listen, this is the animal part of your brain that thinks if I get separated from the pack,
Yeah,
I'm gonna die." That's
right.
essentially what our brains are thinking. And it does, I think in times it can really, really feel like that. You know, for me, it's so much about tuning into your intention.
Mm.
and tuning into who you know you are as a person. I think if you have a false sense of identity, and that's often subconscious, right? I'm a
Mhm.
bad person, I'm not good enough, I'm XYZ. Those subconscious beliefs are going to always show up in how we interact and how we have relationships, how we relate. So, I think that tuning back into your intention, I've certainly been in an experience like this where I was like, okay, I need to check in with this person and just say, hey, when you said that thing, it hurt my feelings and it was really uncomfortable. And, and then they come back and they're like, well, you did this and you did that and whatever. And it's like, oh my gosh, that's so disruptive to the system. And to your point, it's like if you go in and you're planning and you're already moving through all the emotion of having the difficult conversation, showing up, maybe even apologizing, right? Have you ever had that experience where you go to someone and you say, "Hey, I'm really sorry for how this happened," and then they come back and they're like, "Yeah, and actually you did this too," and
Isn't that the worst?
oh my god, it's so dysregulating. It's
Yeah.
such a horrible feeling. It's just like, oh my god, I was coming to you kind of with my tail between my legs to begin with, saying I messed up. I didn't say the nicest thing
Mhm.
and whatever. But I think for me in my life, I deeply had this kind of shame of I said the wrong thing. I'm such a bad person.
Mhm.
Instead of being like, oh my gosh, I'm actually just a human who said something, and my intention was not to offend you at all.
Mhm.
My intention was just to express what I was seeing, be honest. And I think talking about honesty and authenticity is such an important roadmap for how we show up. But I think for me, it was like I was being dishonest
Mm.
in my relationships. So I feel like tuning back into myself and being like, you know what? I was really honest about what I said. And
Mhm.
that person might be hurt by it, but it's my truth. And being able to have my own back and speak my truth, it's sort of the price you pay. Again, their reaction or response is theirs.
Yeah. Yeah, and you kind of talked about when you're the one who's going and being brave and apologizing, and I kinda wanna explore the idea on the other side of the challenge that can come from when you have been hurt, and you're going to somebody informing them that, "Hey, I would like an apology because you've done
Mm,
something." And then I've coached many people where they've done the brave thing, and then the other person does just what you described, where they turn it onto you. "Well, yeah, but you and what you did is worse," and recognizing, I think a lot of it kind of comes down to recognizing when you're in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn.
sure, for sure.
And if you're having that stress response, take a little minute to regulate, because it is easy when somebody is coming at you saying, no, but what you did is worse, or this is bigger. My emotions are bigger, so therefore they're more important.
Yes,
And acknowledging, like, okay, right now I'm experiencing either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. I'm going to take a moment to self regulate so that I can see things more clearly, because that really distorts our lens when we're in that stress response. But just
yeah,
taking that time to self regulate and acknowledge that, okay, well, their emotional response is about them. My emotional reaction is about me. And if I feel like I'm reacting emotionally rather than acting in my own integrity, that's for me to own. I need to check in with me.
for sure. Oh, that's so good. I love that. Emotional and personal integrity is like, whew, I'm gonna put that in my back pocket.
Yeah.
Be- because it's true. It's true. The experience that you're talking about when someone's on the receiving end of like you hurt me,
Hmm.
there's so much to process, and I think that's the key part of all of this is that most of the time we're trying to process by giving the other person our emotional baggage
Yeah.
instead of processing in our own time and in our own way. I think we're bypassing the processing portion of it all. There's so much intellectualizing. There's so much information on the internet and everyone's always up here, right? So I think that's a really, really hard part in all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as you talk about other people coming and kind of emotionally dumping on us, my teenagers refer to that as trauma dumping. They're like,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, this kid just showed up out of nowhere during my lunch period and just started trauma dumping. But even with that experience, when you're able to stand in your own emotional intelligence and recognize, oh, that must be a really hard experience for them, and they must be really overwhelmed. They're so overwhelmed that they're coming up to me who's basically a stranger and sharing all of this without taking it on or over owning that, well, now I am personally responsible for fixing this. And I think that honestly, going to coach training has really helped me with that, because I'm sure that you've experienced that too, where people are coming in a session and they have a lot going on. And for a highly sensitive person, it's very easy to feel for them and to want to be the one to fix it. And then recognizing, okay, I'm going to check myself. That is this a situation where I need to intervene? Sometimes it is. Or is this an experience where they need to learn how to navigate it, and the only way for them to learn how to navigate it is for them to actually work through the process, and that that's okay, that they're going to be better off because I can sit with them and not take it on and
Right.
let them learn how to navigate.
Yeah. I mean, most people, as much as they want to feel better, they don't want to feel like they're a project. They don't want to
Mhm.
feel like they need to be fixed. It really through coach
Yeah.
training. I just talked about this with a friend yesterday. It's silly, but you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And I
Mm.
think so often, because people are so disconnected from their emotions, and I'm thinking of this in the lens of like moms, mothers and daughters, right? Like moms just want their daughters to be happy. And I hear this from so many friends and so many people where they kind of jump to that think positive
Mhm.
mindset. And then I'm saying this through the lens of a daughter, they're like, I'm not there yet,
Yeah.
And then they feel pushed and they feel rushed, and then there's friction and there's tension and all these things. And it's a matter of being like, it's okay that that other person is hurting right now. That's an
Yeah.
appropriate response for what they're going through. Validating someone's emotions is so much more powerful than trying to get them on the express train to feeling better. But most people feel uncomfortable when other people don't feel good or aren't happy. That's a standard, right? We all want to be happy. And I think that sitting in that discomfort is very telling of how somebody else is relates to their own emotions.
Mhm.
I also spoke to somebody the other day who was going through a difficult time, and she said her coworker just sat down and started to trauma dump exactly what you're
Mhm.
describing on her, and was just like, I'm going through this and I'm going through this and I'm going through this. And she's like, I'm going through all that.
Mhm.
Like everything that you're explaining is so tough. So going back to boundaries, there is a boundary that needs to be in place. And that can be really difficult for a highly sensitive person, because you feel like, oh, that person's hurting. I can relate to that so deeply. And I don't want to just cut them off. And I want them to have support. And I of course want them to feel better.
Mhm.
But it's a matter of, again, communication and honesty, of saying, hey, I'm so sorry that you're going through this. I can relate on so many levels. Can I offer you a resource, rather than kind of
Mhm.
offering their self and putting themselves on the line to ease the pain or soothe the discomfort.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate that example because it is a big reminder that when you're engaging with somebody and they're sharing, for example, they're overwhelmed, like the example that you gave, and then you recognize you are feeling overwhelmed. And it's really easy to think, I'm overwhelmed because of them. Right? It's like, no, they're experiencing their overwhelm, and my overwhelm is separate from their overwhelm. And it's a story in my head that they are creating my emotions, but using that as information that, oh, okay, right now I am overwhelmed. And because I'm overwhelmed, I'm going to have a really hard time supporting them in their overwhelm. I'm going to learn how to navigate my overwhelm. I'm going to allow them the opportunity to learn how to navigate their overwhelm. And I could even be honest with them about that if I needed to, right? If it was
Right.
becoming problematic, like you said, stating that boundary with, I wish I could help. I'm really not in a position to help you with this right now.
Yeah.
And again, here's some resources, or hey, like if I give me a day or so to get myself regulated, and then maybe you and I can talk some more. But it takes that emotional maturity to identify what is it that I need right now and actually communicating that.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And you've mentioned this a few times about, it is about like emotional awareness and
Mhm.
emotional maturity. And what you said about when you're overwhelmed and then you're feeling like they're causing you overwhelmed and they're overwhelmed. I mean, relationships really are mirrors,
Yeah.
right? They're so much reflecting back where we need to grow. And it's when I started seeing my life and my relationships through that lens,
Mhm.
all of my relationships changed because I got curious, right? I got curious when someone was annoying me or upsetting me or disappointing me that I was like, what do I need to integrate here? What do
Yeah.
I need to soothe myself, like you're saying, or just being curious in general of like, what is this bringing up for me? Why do I feel like I need to make them feel better? Where is that responsibility coming from? And most of the time it's inner child, but it could be shadow or all
Mhm.
these other things. But sort of moving through my relationships like that
Mhm.
changed so much my outlook on relationships because I don't blame another person. I blame
Yeah.
them so much less. Instead, I'm sort of like, okay, well, what's happening within my experience? And I think that's also not to say that when someone says something hurtful or does something hurtful that it doesn't hurt. When we talk about not owning other people's emotions or I can't make you feel any type of way, it doesn't mean that we're robotic, right? It
Right.
doesn't mean that we just go through life and we're like, I don't care what they say. That can't
Right.
control that.
Right. We're not a jerk. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Right. So it's understanding that when someone says something hurtful, you're still hurt,
Yeah.
but you take ownership of it.
Yeah. So would you mind expanding a little bit more on the idea of viewing your relationships as a mirror and maybe share either a personal example or an example from your practice on
Yeah.
what that can look like? I think that could really help my listeners to develop their own self-awareness.
Yeah. I could probably give you a thousand examples. Let me just give you this one because I
Okay.
think it's very tactile and I can think of another also. But a few things. Oftentimes when what we don't like about another person or what we feel annoyed about or hey, sometimes I'm very cautious about using the word triggered because I think
Mhm.
people use it a little bit too much nowadays, but let's just use for example something that bothers that bothers us about somebody or what they're doing. Oftentimes it's something that we've rejected about ourselves. And in spiritual practices, they often call this shadow. It's sort of something that we picked up along our growth years and saw it as shameful. So we like shoved it down and we're
Mhm.
like, I don't want to act that way. So this example might be somebody who is very outgoing at a party and you're just like, oh, they just need so much attention and they're loud and you might be really annoyed by it. And then when you do further deep investigation, you're like, actually, I remember as a kid that I was really excited about something and somebody, a teacher or a parent or somebody said something to me that made me feel ashamed, like, hey, why are you acting like you need so much attention or attention is
Mhm.
bad? And I took that as, oh my God, I can't act that way. I'm going to shove it down. And, I can't be that way. And that person actually might be showing you what your authenticity is, which might
Mm.
be like expressive and bold and outgoing, right? But maybe you shove that down. So I think that's one example. The other example that I can think of that's so clear is I was in a work experience once in my corporate job
Mhm.
and I remember I was just complaining so much. And I was like, oh, this person, they're so fake. They're just acting so fake. She comes in and she just smiles and acts like everything's fine. And she says that she loves me so much, but then she doesn't give me a raise. And then she doesn't do that. And I was just complaining, like I was
Mhm.
letting it all out. And the core belief I had about that person was she was so fake. I felt like she wasn't being authentic. And I was actually working with a coach at the time and she like smirked at me and I was like, "What?" And she's like, "What do you do? What do you do when she's coming to you and smiling and acting like your best friend?" And I was like, "Well, I smile back and am really nice to her and I compliment her. And then when I walk away, I just feel drained." And she's like,
Mhm.
"You're being fake back." And it was such an aha moment for me. I was
Mm.
like, "Oh my gosh." I could just see it so clearly. I was like, I was complaining so much about that person being fake. And instead
Mhm.
of sitting in those interactions and maybe being a little bit more reserved or being honest about how I was feeling, I was showing up and matching her energy.
Hmm.
And then when we talked it out, and as soon as she said, "You're being fake," my jaw was on the floor. I'm like, I'm not a fake person. And I think this goes back to our integrity, how we're showing up authentically. I was so, I can't explain it better than matching her energy, right?
Yeah.
I was just like, oh my gosh. this person is showing me where I need to authentically show up
Mhm.
and how I'm just sort of playing a role to make her happy. It was a bit of people pleasing, right?
Mhm.
And I think a lot of us in the corporate setting can lean into that kind of easily. So that was just such a moment that I was really pointing the finger, you know? I
Hmm.
was really saying, "Well, you're oh, that person's this way." And I look back and I'm like, "Oh man, I'm that way. I'm showing
Yeah.
up that way."
Yeah, those are such great examples. Recognizing, oh, well, they're so fake or she's masking, and then realizing I'm being fake and I'm masking. And then
Yeah.
your other example, and what came to my mind was oftentimes what comes up for me when I notice somebody's kind of taken the stage when we're out to dinner or something and it's all about that other person, then it's even part of me is like, "Ah, well, they're just taking all of the attention." And it's because part of me would like that attention. I would like a bit of the validation. I would like to have a little bit of floor space. And so using your emotions to gain information about what's happening for you, how am I showing up? What is my contribution to the relationship? Is that what I want my contribution to be in a relationship is so powerful.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I think that experience, whenever you describe things, I can see them so vividly. But in that experience, when you're like, oh my gosh, that person's the center of attention, it goes back to what we were talking about. It's really hard a lot of times for people to be celebrated.
Yeah.
And probably deep down, you're like, you know what? I do want to be center stage. I do want a moment to myself because you're
Yeah.
spending so much time celebrating other people and
Yeah.
giving, 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 giving. And when we talked about all this, it's coming full circle. But
Yeah.
you kind of see in that moment, there's a little bit of a pull of like, eye roll, there's a lot of
Yeah.
eye rolling happening. Usually when I'm rolling my eyes, I'm like, what's going on inside? What
Yeah.
is this up in me?
Yeah, because usually it's coming from that place of insecurity or envy, thinking,
Yeah.
boy, it does actually feel really good when people are saying, wow, they're just so charming. Look at how they can work a room. Those are things that would feel great to hear. And so it's interesting to know, okay, well, what's really the problem for me?
Yeah.
Is how they're showing up, is that really a problem for me? Is it just, like you said, being that mirror and reflecting back to me something about myself? And if I would like to be more charming and more commanding of a room, how would I want to show up and what might that look like and how could I create that? And I don't have to take up as much space as them if I don't want to, but noting that, oh, yeah, I would like to be seen as someone who is gracious and confident and all of those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's so true. You just made whatever something you just said just reminded me of another example. And I think that friendship, friendship keeps coming up in this conversation,
Hmm.
which is really good because I think our friendships, again, are so close to us that
Hmm.
really when that communication starts to break down or there's conflict in that relationship, I think it can be very disruptive. But I think in friendship, that was another at least for me in my I guess in my more recent years, I've
Hmm.
realized relationships that we have with our friends are some of the safest spaces to evolve and to show up more authentically and to really express ourselves. And I've been so lucky to find friends that allow me to address them when say, hey, this was an uncomfortable situation, or hey, I want to make sure we're on the same page here, or whatever. But I remember having an experience where I felt like a friend wasn't reaching out a lot. And I think a past version of me would have just been like, "Oh, she's not reaching out. It's all about her and it's all about this and it's all about that." And again, when I took inventory of the way I was showing up,
Hmm.
I was like, have I texted her to ask her to hang out?
Hmm.
And it was in that moment. It's such a small and probably seemingly obvious thing, but that projection outward of she's different. And the reason it was being projected outward was because she was the one that was often calling and making plans. Not because there was necessarily an imbalance in the friendship, but just because that was sort of the role that she took on. She was always like,
Yeah.
"What are we doing Friday?" She was like the first one to always ask that within the group. And then when that started to change, I started feeling like, "Well, what's going on? Why isn't this person reaching out?"
Hmm.
And in that moment, I was like, "Wait, have I said let's hang out and she said no?" And I'm like, "No, I haven't even given her the opportunity to say no." And I felt so much more at ease when I took that on. When I took
Yeah.
on, okay, I don't think anything's gone wrong in this friendship. She's busy and sort of the things that she wants to do, it's changed a bit. But what the reality is I want to spend time with this person.
Mhm.
That was really what was happening at
Yeah.
the root of it, you know? I think that goes to what you were saying.
Yeah, and taking control of the things you can actually take control of really is empowering. Recognizing, like, oh, guess what? I could hang out if I initiate. Oh, now the ball's in my court. I don't have to wait for her to initiate. And recognizing those patterns of relationship. It was interesting. I had an experience a few weeks back where I had something big happen in my life. And I was like, well, I really want somebody to ask me about it. And as I thought about it, I was like, you know what, though? I really kind of like it when people just share their joy with me. I'm going to practice initiating and not waiting for somebody to ask. And so I sent a message to a girlfriend of mine and just told her, oh, and then this happened and this happened. This was so exciting. And her response was so beautiful because she was almost weepy. And she said, thank you so much for sharing your joy with me. She said that in her relationships, oftentimes it's her doing the reaching out and just how much it meant to her to have me initiate just sharing my joy, not waiting to be asked. And so I was able to recognize that, oh, that has been a part of my conditioning is whatever the case in relationship, I had learned it was not safe to approach unless they let me know that they were ready, right? and,
Totally. Oh,
and
wow.
so
What good
recognizing, oh,
awareness.
okay, well, I've carried that conditioning for way too long. But look how beautiful my connections can be when I'm willing to break those patterns, when I'm willing to share my joy without it being solicited from me, but just having that be part of my joyful expression was a gift to both of us, I think.
I love that so much. I think it's like a 2-minute practice, but
Mhm.
there's actually a study about this. I believe the man's name is Sean Anker. You can find him on a TED Talk. He's on YouTube, and he wrote a book, and he talks about sort of this concept, which is if you spend 2 minutes a day and write a note of gratitude or appreciation or share something with someone that
Mhm.
connects you, your emotional well-being rises
Mhm.
significantly. And it's like a 2 minute, like reaching out to her and expressing that.
Yeah.
It's like you are a pebble in a pond that creates the most beautiful ripple effect for this relationship because
Yeah.
you get to share something that you're so excited about. You choose this person to share it with, and then you feel so fulfilled. And then they express this back. And as we're talking about mirrors, I'm like, oh my God, this is such a beautiful reflection of each other, right?
Yeah.
I think when you receive that back and they're cheering for you and rooting for you, think of how that strengthens your relationship. You're
Mhm.
like, I had just such a good moment. And it was moments probably, was it? It
Yeah.
was such a small moment in time, but it, I always say, oh, I can feel my heart growing 10 sizes, you know, like
Yeah.
you kind of swell up with gratitude. And I think that that's such an important way to nurture as we're talking about imbalance in relationships, but nurturing relationships, it's not complicated.
Yeah.
It's 2 minutes of
Yep.
saying, hey, this is an experience. I wanted to share it with you. And I've had that too. I'm lucky enough to have 3 friends that I've had for almost 20 years. I
Mhm.
went to high school with them. And they're in very different life stages than me. And I can't tell you how many times I've said, hey, I did this thing, or hey, I'm getting back out there and I'm dating. And they just celebrate me in the best, they're reflecting back the most supportive. We're rooting for you. He better be
Yeah.
amazing. Or, oh my God, I can't believe you're doing this. And it just is so loving. A
Yeah.
lot of love. Yeah,
Yeah, that mirroring is about the positive and the negative,
it
and
is.
putting out what you want to receive in and seeing who's going to mirror this back is a beautiful way to see, all right, where do I want to invest my energy and what could this look like? And can I give people permission to do that same thing, to have that ripple effect of positivity?
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that because I think I was focusing just now a lot on negativity of like where you need to grow. But mirrors are exactly that. They're the
Yeah.
positive side too. The beauty that you see in other people, the things that you love about other people, that's a reflection of you.
Mhm.
And I think the more people understand that, it's just such a cool thing to experience and witness and be like, "Oh my God, this person's so joyful." And it's like, well, you're allowing them to show up as themselves and then that's reflected back and oh,
Yeah.
that's so great.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I saw a
Uh,
reel recently where this gal was saying, do you want to know why people hang out with you? It's because they like you, because you're such a great human. Like, that's the only reason why people want to spend time with you is because, yeah, they kinda like you. Like, just accept that. But I think we kind of forget that, right? We tend to want to prove ourselves or make sure that they like us, and it's like, "No, they said yes. They
Yeah.
said yes to the farmer's market. They said yes to dinner. They want to spend time with you just because you're you."
Yes. It's such an obvious I'm laughing because it's so obvious, but it's like
Yeah.
when you hear it out loud, it's like, actually, there's nothing you need to do to be more deserving of friendship and healthy relationships. You
Yeah.
exist as you are, and the right people will follow behind and or alongside you, really.
Yeah, I love that. That's a beautiful place to wrap things up.
Yeah.
But I am curious as we wrap things up, do you have any concluding thoughts around taking that ownership and having accountability in a relationship? Because we all want to have that balance. So,
Yeah.
yeah, what thoughts do you have on that?
I think this is a journey, right? Everything that
Mm,
we're talking about, I mean, I've moved through all of this stuff over years and it ebbs and flows.
mhm.
Sometimes I'm like, "Oh, I'm so good at handling all these relationships." And even as someone that coaches on it, I'm not a robot.
Yeah.
This stuff comes up and reflects things back to me all the time that I'm like, "Okay, there's something here that I need to integrate or something that's bringing something up in me." So, just remembering that this is a journey and that it starts with awareness. Without awareness, you mentioned it, the emotional awareness,
Mhm.
also the cognitive awareness of what you're thinking about a situation and what you're feeling. And everything we're talking about is a learned skill.
Mhm.
So I think allowing yourself to be a beginner in this process and understand that you're probably going to get it wrong. And
Yeah.
that's okay. That's part of it. And being brave enough to get it wrong and strive to being better is the journey. And it's worth taking.
Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for being here, Kellen. And thank you for being one of those friends in my life that helps me to find that balance and
Same.
deepen my own awareness. I deeply appreciate you.
I
So,
feel the same.
so can you tell us how can people find you if they would like to work with you? How can they find you?
Yes, you can reach me at daydreamercoaching.com or on Instagram at daydreamercoaching.
Awesome. And I'll put her contact information in the show notes. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
you.
This was so fun and what a beautiful conversation. I appreciate you.
All right. Well, have a great week, everybody. I'll see you next time. Bye.